So welcome to this third webinar celebrating the new Septima Clark Learning Center at Highlander. Tonight's a special edition on land, decolonization, and resistance, as it's represented in some of the archival materials that we'll be getting into a little bit. We got folks from all over registered for this call who are wanting to receive the recording of this call, and we'll be happy to get into that with and tonight, as more folks will be joining, we're going to let folks trickle in over the course of the next half hour or so. Just a little bit about the call and a little bit about the Learning Center for folks who are new to this. We at Highlander, where we are today in Newmarket, Tennessee, we're about to be building new programming for the Septima Clark Learning Center, which will house the library and archives and also a large multi-purpose space. Where we are today in Newmarket, Tennessee, and I'll get you a little bit of that in a minute. But the Learning Center is named after Septima Clark, and for those who don't know, Septima is sometimes referred to as the grandmother of the civil rights movement for her role while on staff at Highlander in bringing the citizenship school program, which expanded the voting rights and voting access to close to 700,000 folks throughout the South and building Black political power in an era of Jim Crow. So Highlander is honored to have Septima as part of our legacy, and we're happy to facilitate on behalf of her legacy at Highlander, a new learning center that'll help do the same kind of work. So just a couple of ground rules for tonight. We're really excited for folks to be on this call. We're gonna have you on mute, and we will open up from mute after the presentation and when we get into Q&A time. But speaking of Q&A, if you do have a question throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask you to type that question in, if you're on Zoom proper, to type that question into the chat box, and then we'll have an opportunity after we go through those questions to check in with folks who might be on the phone and who might have a question. And we'll make sure we get you there too. I'm trying to think if there's any other business. Just want to let you know that Ashley Woodard Henderson, my amazing co-executive director, is going to be running back of the house stuff. So she's going to keep folks on mute. She's going to release mute at the proper times. She's going to let me know if we need to catch anything and attend to anything. And we are recording this webinar for sharing it out, which will be on our website too. And we can put that link to the Septima Clark Learning Center page so that you can get other webinars and stay up to date on the campaign. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to, oh, actually, could you click to a couple slides because I want to give folks a chance to the next slide. So for folks who are excited as we are about this new building, we are going to be able to break ground in the spring. That's the goal, assuming that all things with some of the structural tests go well. And as you can see on the left side of your screen, for those who are able to see it, that's the general mock-up of the outdoor. Down below is the site plan that you can see. And it's going to be not only a new building that houses our library and archives up top, but also a multi-purpose space downstairs for larger meetings than we've currently been able to hold in our workshop center, but also multi-purpose space like photographs, film, art making, and other kinds of larger groups. And it'll also be going into redesigning the site plan in between all of our structures up at the top of the hill in Newmarket. And then on the right side of the page, you can see the basic vision for what we're going to be doing inside there. So this is the vision for it. Again, we're going to be breaking ground in April. That's the big goal. And we are excited to share some of the stuff that you would be able to find and have access to this updated building and updated programming. So I'm going to kick it over to Susan to get us rolling on that.
So, am I unmuted? Yeah. So just to say that there's the building and then there's all the materials that have been collected over 86 years of Highlander. And this is sort of a mosaic of some of the materials that we have in our library. And so part of what we want to do is really help these stories move beyond the walls of the building into the larger world to help inspire activists, to support students and professors and people who are interested in social movements. So what we're doing with this webinar is just doing a kind of a quick brush through time of Highlander stories related to decolonizing, resistance, and land. You want to go to the next slide? We wanted to give kind of an overview. So in this week of Thanksgiving, that seems like an appropriate theme, as we know that we've learned very little about what actually happened in this country around colonizing. So I was trying to think about how to talk about colonization and decolonization, and I decided to pull a graphic actually from a current resource we have. This is from our Mapping Our Futures curriculum, and it's a graphic of From Power Over to Shared Power. So it's kind of trying to show a graphic of what ways to move beyond colonization. We call it the boot diagram because there's a big boot, which is the power over boot, and we want to recognize the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, who do amazing anti-racism training for the boot metaphor. So this is kind of a way that we sort of try to portray what are some things that can move us toward shared power in this world, that we need investment, reparations, global movements for democratic and a just sustainable future, democratic financing, participatory governance, and people of color, indigenous, and front. Just kind of share this as a quick metaphor for how we can think about colonization and decolonization. And now I just would like to just say a little bit of acknowledgement, which I'm sure we all kind of know these things, but this week it seems important to especially remember them. These are kind of the story of our country before 1932 when Highlander started. So we want to acknowledge the Cherokee people who lived where Highlander was before and where it is now, before their land was stolen by invading white people looking for gold, land, and wealth. We acknowledge the Trail of Tears and other genocidal moves that decimated these peoples and removed many to Oklahoma. There were earlier peoples in this Tennessee Valley going back many thousands of years, whose stories we know very little about, but we know that they were here. We know that enslaved Africans were brought to this country and to this hemisphere to provide captive labor to work the land, build a society that benefited white society, losing lives, country, family, language, culture, and land. And their ancestors are still fighting for freedom and reparations across the South and the U.S. We know that land and resources are lures for fortune, and that the South and Appalachia are just one of many places where people and corporations have come to buy and control land, resources, and minerals to extract them for wealth. We know that forces in our country have been responsible for colonization across the world with dire impacts on life, community, culture, land, and sovereignty, often using extreme violence. There are stories of migration and displacement for many people historically and now. But for the sake of this webinar, we know that there have always been resistance and movement. And so we wanted to share a few stories linked with Highlander's work. One comment was, if you're interested in knowing any more about any of these stories, this is the kind of work we're trying to sort of pull out of our history, so feel free to contact me now or in the future. We'll start with Highlander starting. So Dr. Lillian Johnson had come to Grundy County in the 1920s to help build buildings and teach people about cooperatives in order to help people be able to farm and stay on the land in Grundy County. In 1932, she turned over their property to some young people in the 26, Don West and Miles Horton, who had come from Denmark and were inspired by the folk schools, place-based schools in Denmark that were in rural areas designed to help people, help to do education for people to learn to be citizens in a growing new democracy. The Highlanders did much work in the local community, work with labor struggles. There was a nursery school. That's what this picture of the kids in the train are. There were gatherings. This man talking to the group was a lay meeting, and that man made chairs for Highlander. And the lower picture is a picture of the building that Dr. Lillian Johnson had built and left for Highlander. So I showed these pictures probably because for Highlander, the importance of having a place, land, and buildings where people come to reflect and recharge was critical then and is still critical for Highlander's mission today. And not so ironically, Highlander was chased out of Montego, closed down by the state of Tennessee in '61, and then was chased out of Knoxville by urban renewal in the Black community in the late '60s, and so ended up in Newmarket where we are today. So we've moved many times, really because we were not liked because of the resistance we supported. One story that, you can go to the next one. One story that's not been told much is about Highlander's work with the Farmers Union. The National Farmers Union was a progressive farmers movement across the country. And Highlander partnered with them to do organizing for the Farmers Union in the South. They built chapters in Greenville, Tennessee, in Summerfield, Tennessee, and in Kodak, Tennessee, which is actually quite near where we are now. And they worked with farmers in southern Alabama. The Farmer Union members in Alabama were both black and white farmers, and they organized a cooperative to build, to make fertilizer so that they could buy fertilizer cheaper than what the company sold it to them. The hope was to build a farmer and labor coalition in the South, but in the early 50s, the National Farmers Union decided to redirect resources to the Midwest, where there were many more farmers and members, and also because Highlander was being red baited. This threat was used to scare farmers from joining in the Farmers Union in Tennessee counties. The long struggle for civil and human rights is a long haul fight, and many Black people in the South over many centuries have been part of that struggle. The struggles are many, but include struggles for citizenship, for equity, for resources and jobs, for land, and for communities against solid systems of white supremacy. Highlander began integrated workshops early and focused on civil rights in the 50s, supporting communities across the South. There were many strategies for what people tried to do: building cooperatives, holding citizenship schools to increase literacy and political power, leadership training to build political power, and getting equal access to resources, schools, and public places were primary goals of the 50s and 60s in many communities. These fights were sometimes successful, sometimes so not, but as we know, the fights are still very fierce. There's fights for voting rights, as we've seen in the last election, for access to education and healthcare, for prison abolition and fights against mass incarceration, state violence, and the school to prison pipeline, and for access to land and resources and maintaining communities, particularly in light of high levels of gentrification. Highlander, I just wanted to point out the collage that's kind of in the middle. There was a film center at Highlander, and they would do these photo collages, and this was from the Race Relations Department at Fisk, which was a partner with Highlander, and there were people on the board from Fisk on the Highlander board. In Appalachia, much of the land is owned by outside people and corporations. Much of the land was bought in the late 1800s to gain access to resources as the country was industrializing. Forestry, clear cutting, and mining for coal became major enterprises in Appalachia. And in the 60s and 70s, coal mining started being done by strip mining, and strip mining took the top off the land. It was basically unregulated, so there was huge devastations for the land, for people's communities, people's wells. There was major flooding in 1977 that propelled groups in Appalachia to form the Appalachian Alliance. And they continued for a number of years doing work. They created a land task force that did a land ownership study in 1981, which was an epic participatory action research study led by communities in the South. This was before laptop computers, so there was gigantic computers somewhere where people coded sheets. Massive amounts of information were collated into 6 state studies and then into a final study. And the study was partly funded by Appalachian Regional Commission, but because of its political and truthful nature, they refused to publish it. So much of this information has not actually been very, very accessible until the last couple of years. On the right here is a book actually done by the Appalachian Alliance to help people learn about researching land and minerals in their communities so that people could begin to take on who was controlling their communities. The next slide has just a picture of kind of the region that the study covered. Again, it was 6 states, from Alabama to West Virginia. Do you want to go to the next slide? So these are the states that were involved in the study. There was the overall findings. I'm sorry you can't read this. I tried to make it readable, but the challenges of digital format. That 1% of the owners owned 44% of the land across these states. They were Appalachian mountain states in these regions. 72% of the land was absentee owned, and tax rates were very low. The case study showed the connection between poverty and the low taxation of these corporations and the lack of decent schools and social structures in these counties. This was an amazing amount of information. Out of this study came the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, first called the Kentucky Fair Tax Coalition, who challenged the assessment of minerals and had brought millions of dollars into Kentucky. The research itself is now been digitized and is at the Appalachian State Appalachian Archives, which is kind of amazing. These gigantic state studies, 1,800 pages of materials. And there's a new effort to update the land study. Highlander has 2 Appalachian Fellows working on doing some research in Clearfield, Tennessee, and Mingo County. And that is the effort to update and expand the study into the region now to find out what is happening. Highlander in the 70s also began working with local communities. There was a time when people were starting to really recognize the toxic pollution in their communities and to begin to protest about it. Highlander's first work was with Bumpus Cove, which is up in Upper East Tennessee, where hazardous waste were just being dumped into a landfill. In Kingsport, Tennessee, where Eastman Chemical was polluting the valley, and Yellow Creek near Middlesboro that was being poisoned by chemicals from a tannery. The work expanded in the 80s and 90s as groups across the South and Appalachia began appearing, and there was a whole series of STP workshops where people would come together, learn about each other, develop strategies, sometimes find connections in terms of corporations, and it was part of what was a whole national regional effort, which would now be called environmental justice, but at that term wasn't really recognized till the early 90s. STP, people always said that, and here's what they would answer. It can mean stop the poisoning, start the party, shoot the politicians, whatever you want it to be. Which I always thought was kind of a funny answer, but that's what they would say. But the workshops were done in this region and in across the country, and other people learned how to do the process too. One important thing that happened during that time was the People of Color Environmental Summit. And in the early 1990s, people of color assembled in DC and developed the environmental justice principles. And this was after there'd been research showing that people of color communities, especially poor communities, were most likely targeted for toxic waste dumps and facilities. There was a lot of research done with people, workshops. This was, again, before computers, where you couldn't get on and just search for a chemical. So you had to look in books and research guides, had to go to offices and look through materials. And Juliet Merrifield, who did this report, We're Tired of Being Guinea Pigs, did a lot of work with people to just understand what chemicals they were being exposed to and what the health effects were, and also what corporations were responsible for the facilities. A lot of people actually stopped proposed facilities during this time, and so some of the successes were things that were not ever built. It's, I think, an interesting story that's not been told well enough. Out of this environmental work, people started making a lot of connections around global corporations, which were one manifestation of how colonization happens in these days. So global corporations going around the world to look for resources and exploit communities. So Highlander became hooked up with people in India, and around the time that the Bhopal Union Carbide plant in Bhopal released a chemical cloud. It was the worst industrial accident, I think, still in this country, in this world. It ultimately killed at least 15,000 people, although no one really knows for sure. People were blinded. People were dealt with health effects. There was a plant that was right in the middle of a very dense urban community. So Highlander helped to publicize this event in the U.S. because it was important to try to bring Union Carbide to justice, and they needed pressure from the United States. That was very difficult to do. People in Bhopal are still organizing and still awaiting justice. One thing that Highlander did do was connect people from Bhopal who were exposed to poisons in Union Carbide to people in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where Union Carbide was a contractor for the Department of Energy facilities, and also Institute, West Virginia, where there was another plant making the chemical MIC, which was the poisonous gas that poisoned people in Bhopal. It was only 10 years, within the last 10 years, that the people in Institute, West Virginia managed to get that plant to quit making MIC. And Union Carbide has since not become the contractor in Oak Ridge, but they also brought people from Bhopal to come and tell their story in the US. It was very, one example of how corporate connections were made to support people across the world. On the next page is just a map from the No Place to Run that showed Union Carbide operations across the world. The report was done by Highlander and also the Patisserie Research Institute of Asia. And then other people contributed stories from around the world. And this was sort of the time when people started saying we need to look at these corporations to see what they're doing and not let them get off one posing people against each other, but also recognizing the significant impacts they have around the world. In 1992, there was a first UN conference on sustainability. It was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. For a UN conference, it had a huge crowd. There was a parallel Earth Summit. Highlander was asked to actually collect stories from people across the United States. They were encouraged to collect these stories by people in other countries who said that the US always acts like everything is fine in the US. And when they heard stories from people in the US, they thought that was important to know. So Highlander collected over 150 stories from the US, were put in this book, and also sponsored a delegation to go to Rio de Janeiro. The term sustainability was first started being used in this UN summit, was probably quickly co-opted, but the kind of helping people sort of see the global dimensions of this work was important. It was also one of the first places that a global climate treaty was passed. On the front of the cover, it says, "We are finally learning what those in the southern countries have known for so long, that huge multinational corporations have no allegiance to country, to people, to the environment, nor to anything but their own ledger sheets." On the next page is just a little map that showed where the stories were collected from. There was a number of stories from Chemical Alley in Louisiana, from the oil and gas facilities along the Gulf Coast in Texas, a lot of Appalachian stories, and toxic and chemical plants. Little cluster of dots is a lot where Highlander is. And then stories from across the US. Most of these communities had come to SDP workshops, and so that's sort of how they gathered and knew people. In the 1980s, I just had the conversation today about globalization and colonialization, and to me, those are the same impetuses of global elites working to take control of resources around the world. In the 80s, it took the form of corporations moving factories from the South US to lower wage countries, displacing workers and decimating communities. Highlander helped form the Tennessee Industrial Renewal Network to work with people to try to stop plant closings, to help workers figure out what they could do when the jobs disappeared. This was a time when a lot of service jobs were being created, and so the jobs that were being created were not equal to the jobs that were leaving. Turn was really just working locally, but became aware through a trip to Mexico to the Maquilas about the North American Free Trade Agreement. And these trade agreements are really ways for global corporations to set up rules so that they can move more easily around the world. And this work with Turn really helped us educate people about NAFTA and to fight the North American Free Trade Agreement in a coalition with Canada and Mexico. Important to mention because NAFTA has been renegotiated once again, and it will be up for congressional review, and there's people fighting to get better protections for workers and environment and less rights for the corporations. NAFTA passed and in Mexico, what people from Mexico said would happen, did happen, which was that people were going to be displaced in the country. There was a major peso devaluation, loss of small farms when imports of US corn and other foods that were cheaper were brought into the country. There were constitutional changes that allowed communal lands to be sold. And so there was a very large influx of people from Mexico into the South and Appalachian region, into many communities where that was not a population that had existed before. So Highlander, out of the kind of work with farm workers and also work with trade, started trying to see what did this immigration mean for us in this country and to try to build connections across between immigrants and refugees and then people from the South, particularly Black and white citizens communities. There was a lot of organizing, building networks for immigrant rights groups. The picture is a protest that the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition held in Nashville when there was a terrible bill passed called the Ford Sensenbrenner bill. Hold on, let me just.
Life goes on, Susan.
Sorry. No one ever calls me except for when I'm on something. Anyway, so as we all know, so there's a much larger immigrant and refugee organized community in the country now, but as we know, there's continual and increased attacks that have really helped to build the right and try to undermine progressive political work. Coming to today, this is again a reference to our Mapping Our Futures curriculum, trying to build a social solidarity economy. So we're looking for ways that people resist and create decolonized spaces around the world. And the curriculum is available online. Happy to talk to you more about it. It is it's a popular education process for communities to look at their communities, to think about what is impacting them and what are the ways that the economy and governance system could be different. So it's designed to help support community work and help people find some inspiration and some strategy that could be helpful to them. So since it is the week of Thanksgiving, it does seem important to give thanks. And so I think that we should be thanking all the freedom fighters who came before us. These are some pictures from Highlander's history. I know that there's many freedom fighters that you all know, that you probably related to, that you've read about. And so I hope we will all give thanks to all the freedom fighters who came before us. And thanks to you all and all the freedom fighters organizing in these challenging days. This is a quote from Septima Clark, one of my favorite quotes that she said. She said, "I know I'm not weaving my life's patterns alone. Only one end of the threads do I hold in my hand. The other ends go many ways, linking my life with others." Septima Clark.
Thanks so much, Susan. This last slide here is just an update on where we stand with the campaign. This is just a touch out of date because since our last webinar last month, we've already raised over $5,000 on top of this $465,000. So we're well over 60% toward our total goal and getting really close to closing the gap on what it means to actually break ground and build the building. So we're really excited to go confidently into the end of the year with that. If folks want to get involved with the campaign, I can give you a heads up about that in just a second. But I wanted to make sure that people had a chance to add or ask any particular questions to what Susan shared with us. I didn't see anything coming up in the group chat. So I want to give just maybe a few seconds if anybody wants to chat something in there to get a question. And if I don't hear from folks in the chat box, I want to make sure that our friends on the phone have some space, but we'll wait for the chat box for just a second. You'll see, for those of you who are looking at the chat box, you'll see that I went ahead and entered the URL for the curriculum that Susan was mentioning. So feel free to take a look at that. That's stuff that's live, you can download.
You also can feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question if you're on the phone or on video chat.
Please do. Good. I'm going to add a couple other things in here in the chat box while people might be drumming up the energy to ask or pose a question. Some other links in here for folks, more direct links to our website from the to learn more about this campaign and also different webinars from the past. And then Susan mentioned the holiday known as Thanksgiving. dropping a few URLs in here about decolonizing the history of Thanksgiving, and want people to take a look at that as well. Feel free to share that around. Cool. Well, without any questions, if I'm not hearing those, feel free to, Ash, if you don't mind queuing up that last page of the slide. Down at the bottom, you can see my name, and I'm going to go ahead and type my email address into the chat box as well. It's Allyn at highlandercenter.org. That's ALLYN at highlandercenter.org. We are looking for folks to serve as leads or captains, as we're calling them, in raising the resources for the campaign. And that can be folks who are in academia, folks who are in grassroots research work, grassroots organizing work, who want to get down and be a part of this campaign. Like I said, we just had a really wonderful gift from the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists who contributed over $5,000 to us recently. We're really excited and grateful for that campaign. Came into this last month. So again, if you're interested in getting involved, ALLYN at highlandercenter.org. You can also see it here on the webinar. On that at the bottom of the page, you can get directly in contact with me. If you love these webinars and you're down to get into more historical archival work, go ahead and save the date for December 11th, 7 Eastern. Go ahead and put that on your calendar. And then also January 15th at 7 Eastern. And we'll be blasting out registration for this over the next couple of weeks, but we want to get people a heads up. December 11th at 7 Eastern and January 15th at 7 Eastern. We're going to have a couple more webinars rolling out for you about the Learning Center. I've been talking a lot. I want to make sure there's one around of anybody who might have a question. You can unmute yourself and ask away. Okay, well, without any questions, we're going to definitely have this saved and downloaded and on our website for folks to download and spread the word around this. From our website, that link I already posted up there. It's the Our Impact at Septima Clark or / Septima Clark Learning Center page on our website. We'll have that posted up soon. And there's nothing else. Thanks so much for folks for joining us tonight. Thank you, Susan, for preparing this awesome insight into our materials, and thank everybody from coming from all over to be on this call.